Yes, so we now have a little bit of time for some discussion with the panel. Unfortunately, we're running a little behind, so there may not be so much time for discussion later, but we have on the panel who are Atalay Iyeli from Ethiopia, Carmine Galasso from University College London, Matthew Freeman Arabs, and Terence Namaona from Malawi. My apologies that and final details I sent to the panel yesterday, I mixed up the time zones. So I'm sorry to Atalay and Terence about that. Atalay's with us. I saw Terence with us earlier on the Zoom call. Terence, are you there now?
I am available.
Oh, you are? Okay, I did. Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. You haven't got your name on the. Okay, good. I'm pleased you're there. I wondered if it might be because of my mistake of the time zones that you weren't with us at the moment. Okay, thank you, Terence. Okay, so we've asked the members of the panel to address the same three issues as we've got on the Padlet, and I do encourage you to put your own comments there as we go on. So the three questions are to raise the key challenges for addressing disaster risk reduction from multiple natural hazards in the East African Rift, to identify emerging research priorities and objectives for disaster risk reduction from natural hazards in the East African Rift, and to raise any other comments that have been emerged from the day or things we have omitted which should be addressed. So I'll introduce each member of the panel in turn to give you their comments on those points. So first of all, there's Professor Atalay Iyeli, who's Director of the Institute of Geophysics, Space Sciences and Astronomy at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. He was awarded the American Geophysical Union International Award for 2021.
Thank you.
So is the Secretary of the East and South African Regional Seismological Working Group, and he also works on volcano risk as well as earthquakes. So Atalay, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. I would like to make my remarks with the slides. Is that possible, Joe? If you allow me.
That's fine. I think you should have permission to share.
Well, host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, that's better because the screen tells better than the words. If you can allow me, yeah.
Joe, could you give Atalay permission, please?
Atalay, I think you should have permission because I can see you appear as a host, so possibly you should be able to share screen.
I think it's coming, yes.
Okay,
It's
fantastic.
Yeah. Slide control, I think it's, can I project? Yeah, from beginning, yeah. I have a few comments to make. My expertise is seismology, but from like 20 years of experience as a seismologist in Ethiopia, I have some experiences which I can share with colleagues here. So hi everyone. So the first point which I would like to forward in the first key issues is that government's attention is episodic in the region. Whenever there is some earthquake hazard or flood or whatever, governments respond when it happens and then back to square one. There is no follow-up on disaster management. Follow-ups like monitoring facilities or building capacity and the like. So that's a problem. And also international collaborations are also episodic, from my experience again, whenever big events kick in the East African Rift, our overseas collaborators come when those events happen and then they pack up their equipment and go back home. So in between we miss some important events also for follow-up. That's also one issue which I would like to forward in this topic. We are missing signs and also fail to reduce risk because of lack of funding for rapid response. This is really very serious because when some events happen, for instance, dike intrusion or earthquake hazard, to go to the field, you have to collect 9 signatures from our administration, make permissions and allowance for money and field vehicles and the likes, which may take like 3, 4, 5 days, and in due course you will miss the events. That's another challenge or key problem. The other one is brain drain and staff retention, or in general, experts go for a better pay job, and it's very difficult to maintain experts in observatories and institutes. So that's a challenge. In this heading, I think it is cutting off. Anyway, the topic is very clear for you guys. So what would be good to do would be hazard assessment as a priority, hazard assessment and developing reasonable models or building codes, for instance. So there are a lot of things in the hazard assessment part, like, recording events, assessing with the state-of-art softwares and the likes. There are a lot of things out there. Building human and equipment capacity for rapid response, financial and supporting monitoring facilities in East Africa, as the high quality data is the first requirement for reliable disaster management. Here also as another issues, expanding and strengthening real-time data flow. What would be to do? I mean, would be real-time data flow and building facilities and expertise in that area. Support local experts if there is a genuine concern from the international donor community. Because this one, I can give you some examples. From the overseas researchers, I can categorize into 2. One is basic science researchers who are really interested to come and do research with African partners. And there are also others, freelance experts who can be asked by a World Bank or African governments for assessment. So it's very difficult really to support local expertise. That's really a challenge. If local experts need some support, they don't get it that easily. It's very difficult. So that's a challenge.
Excuse me, Atalay. Sorry, your slides don't seem to be showing properly. Could you try stop sharing and start sharing again, please?
Okay, yep. Stop sharing. Yep. I think I am done. Almost that's the end of it.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
So shall I share again, or?
If you can.
I think I'm almost done.
Okay, that's fine then. Okay.
So, probably what I would like to emphasize, the last comment is that the for capacity building and equipment, building expertise, and or even rapid response mitigation measures, it's not easy to get support from donors for local experts. Some in the case of the Mozambique earthquake and the Malawi Karonga, for instance, somebody from somewhere was funded by World Bank, and so the local experts were not really on board in some cases. I think that's what I would like to forward. I think. Thank you, John. That's all I can say.
Okay, thank you, Atalay. Yes, sorry about the screen sharing there. Maybe if you could send your slides over, then we can share them after, so people can see those. Okay, thank you. Okay, so next on the panel we have Professor Kamini Galasso, who's Professor of Catastrophe Risk Engineering in the Department of Civil and Environmental and Geomatic Engineering at University College London, who works on development and application of probabilistic and statistical methods and tools for catastrophe risk modelling and disaster risk reduction, considering multiple natural hazards. So over to you, Kamini.
Thanks, John. Hello, everybody. Thanks for this very exciting session today. Yeah, I'm coming from a risk modeler perspective. So as my title says, I'm a catastrophe risk engineer. So the challenges that I would like to highlight, I also have slides I'm going to share, but I know we are late, so I'm not going to spend too much time going slide by slide. So what I'm showing here are challenges mainly from a modeling point of view. So if you want to reduce disaster risk, of course, we first need to understand and quantify disaster risk. And so I think one of the challenges, so I'm working quite a lot in a project, in a GCRF project called Tomorrow Cities. We are not working specifically in East Africa, but one of the main challenges that we are actually trying to address is that when we try to quantify and try to model risk, we often focus on today's risk, but particularly in East Africa and in many other cities globally, we know that those cities are expanding very rapidly. So that means that, for instance, these are some statistics from UN Habitat. 60% of the area expected to be urban by 2030 is yet to be built. So what that means? That means that when we do risk modeling, typically we look at what we call exposure, so an inventory of asset, infrastructure, people, but it's pretty much a snapshot of what is the current exposure today look like, and also then the corresponding vulnerability and capacity. So I think what is the challenge is that actually what is the current exposure and vulnerability today is very different what will happen, what will be there in 20 years, in 30 years, and 40 years, or even more. So I think really what the big challenge is how we can use risk modeling and disaster risk reduction at urban planning stage, rather than just trying to fix mistakes that have been made in the past, because, for instance, again, coming from an engineering background, poor enforcement of building code, or building code which is not well evolved enough. So what we are trying to do in our project, for instance, and I think that's very relevant here as well, is really try to focus on future development, not just on past mistakes. We, of course, and today has been discussed a lot, that of course we need to acknowledge the importance of multiple hazards. Current approaches to risk pretty much look at just single hazards, but there are different type of interactions and dependencies between hazards, and not just on the physical phenomena, but also, for instance, in terms again of vulnerability, because you can have some sort of damage accumulation from a physical vulnerability point of view, but also from a social vulnerability point of view for communities, for instance, that are exposed to multiple hazards in a given time frame. And of course, these require multiple disciplines. Engineers cannot work, in isolation without working, for instance, with hazard modeler, without working with social scientists, with with people expert in risk communication, for instance, and so on. But another very interesting aspect, and I think what Jamie early in his presentation was kind of highlighting, is when we currently do risk modeling for disaster risk reduction, we quantify risk in terms of, typically in most of the application, in terms of physical damage. For instance, Jamie I think was mentioning, what house damage means to communities. And for instance, in a more insurance and insurance perspective, it is translating quantifying risk in terms of losses. So we say, what is the impact of that particular hazard scenario in our building portfolio, in our infrastructure system in terms of losses. What really is missing, I think, currently is really understanding that physical damage and losses are a very narrow measure of what the impact of natural hazard is. I have a slide, again, I'm not going in detail, but I think that's a very easy to understand. You don't need to be a hazard modeler to understand this example. If I want to build a new coastal protection in a given area, I know I have two projects. A project A, which costs 100 million for a given area, and could be, I'm not saying yet where the given area is. Project B costs again 100 million, it's the same project. But the difference is that project A will prevent on average 20 million of losses per year, while project B will prevent on average 5 million of losses per year. When I say losses, again, losses in terms of economic losses, physical damage. Now, you don't need to be a risk modeler. Of course, if I say, which project is more convenient given the limited budget, of course, we all will say project A is more convenient and we should go for project A. But if I show what actually project A is doing and what project B is doing, you can clearly see that, again, using economic losses and dollar losses and physical damage as a measure of risk is actually a very biased way. You may have, project A, yes, cost 100 million, is reduced to 20 million because maybe it's protecting 4 million very expensive houses somewhere in Southern California. Project B is actually reducing less simply because, more marginalized communities have less to lose. So that's, I think, it's a big challenge in risk modeling and in disaster risk reduction, but it's also an opportunity. Going back to the second question, what are the opportunities? It's really how we can better quantify what, risk means to different stakeholders from, including again the more marginalized communities in East Africa, but in many other places of the world. So really what I think is important is, how we can make sure that, again, our way of quantifying risk is actually accounts, for instance, for the perspective and priorities, for instance, of the urban poor. I'm not going in too much in detail. I'm happy, and I know Matthew is familiar with some of this work. We have been in discussion, for instance, to try to interact more. But really the idea, what we are trying to do in this project is to try to change a bit the way in which we assess risk, and we use risk frameworks for reducing risk, for instance, through what we call policies that are kind of kind of fixing, as I said before, past mistakes. And so the idea is to use policies, for instance, more looking forward in terms of planning, and that policy which can be like hard policy, engineering policy, better buildings, more resilient buildings, better enforcement of building code, and so on, but can also be some sort of soft policies, for instance, looking at insurance, any type of benefit, risk communication, risk education, for instance. So I think that's really, again, if in summary, I think those are I would say the two key areas that I think really deserve, special focus, and also provide opportunity for further research. Focus on the future, not just on current risk. So, and again, looking at climate change, of course, that's even more obvious, but also try to quantify risk, to make the concept of risk, to democratize the concept of risk is what we keep saying, for instance, in our project, making sure that, risk is not just quantify in some sort of dollar losses what the impact of disaster will be, but try to use other type of metrics, same as Jamie was mentioning, as access to infrastructure, well-being losses, other type of infrastructure are actually more meaningful, particularly for the more marginalized part of the community. That's it for me, and happy to take any question or any comment on that. Stop sharing. Thanks a lot. Hopefully I was not too long.
Many thanks, Carmine. Okay, we'll move on to Dr. Matthew Free, who's a director of ARUP, head of the Hazard and Risk Management for the UK and Middle East and Africa region. He works on strategies for managing risk from natural hazards and enhancing resilience at city and national scale. And he's been an advisory board member for the Prepare project, for which we've been very grateful. So over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, John. And just first off, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's been a fantastic workshop, and my compliments to all the speakers. It's been really tremendous session, and I can assure you that I'm from ARUP. We're an engineering consultancy, if you don't know the organization, and we're really actively listening to what you're saying, and this is really important knowledge for us so that we can improve the work that we do. Very difficult, of course, to do justice to the quality of work that's come in the presentations in a 5-minute discussion, and but I am interested that the points that I would like to make are so closely related to what Carmine has just described. Actually, it seems like we discussed it in advance, but it's not the case. And my points are related to, I'm very pleased to see that so many of the speakers described their work in terms of that risk equation. It appeared so many times, hazard times exposure times vulnerability, and that people were giving equal attention to the quantification of hazard, but also the exposure and the vulnerability. And then if I give some points on the challenges, I'd like to make them in terms of the challenges related to exposure, the hazards, and the vulnerability. And just briefly, I recognize that I can't generalize. Africa is a continent, there's 54 countries, there's 18 countries in East Africa. So, in 5 minutes, my points are a little bit general, but I appreciate it's not a good idea to generalize when we're talking about Africa. So in very average terms, exposure in East Africa, I understand that the number is about 55 to 62% of people are employed in agriculture. 95% of cropland is fed by rainfall, right? But those things are changing rapidly, as Carmen noted. So there's huge increase in population. There's huge and rapid urbanization, and also the fastest growing economies in the world. So all that change is happening, and if somebody is trying to map exposure, it's very difficult, as Carmen indicated, from a quantitative point of view. The other point I'd like to make with regard to the impact is utilizing this equation and doing of risk equals hazard times exposure times vulnerability is a very sensible way of doing the analysis, because it does allow, when approached with a spatial context, it does allow the priorities to be set based on metrics that are consistent across the different natural hazards and their contribution to risk. And I know that Jamie Richardson pointed out this issue with regard to health and well-being numbers being so greater in terms of the risk from the natural hazards, but I would see those health and well-being numbers in the context of meteorological hazards. They're related to climate and weather conditions, the spread of disease, etc., is sort of part of the reason why I would argue that still go about doing the health calculations in terms of hazard times exposure times vulnerability. But I appreciate that in the context of vulnerability, that it is multi-dimensional, and many of the speakers alluded to this and emphasized this point. And I know that the physical vulnerability part, being able to quantify how a building will respond or a piece of infrastructure will respond when shaken by an earthquake, for example, it's very important to understand that, or if it's inundated by a flood, or if it's covered by volcanic ash, for example, as indicated by some of the speakers. That is very important, but the problem with vulnerability is the contribution that comes from the socioeconomic and political factors, which people mentioned, but therefore vulnerability becomes very difficult to quantify. And that's an important research area, I believe, because those factors are what will control the outcome. Like political decisions and the socioeconomic factors will control the outcome in a lot of the cases, or they will contribute more significantly. A good thing is that many of the speakers talking about vulnerability talked about the need to involve and support communities in that decision making, and I think that's really important. So I support that one very strongly. And the other obvious one to me, from my experience, is the importance of involving women. And it just appears that the cost benefit of involving women is very significant. So community involvement and the involvement of women seems to be the most successful and cost-effective approach to disaster risk reduction. And I know there's cultural sensitivities, but that's just got to be the way forward. That's sort of the response to the first question. And then the second question with regard to research priorities, there's many and very difficult to do in a short time frame, but it's just absolutely important that all the research continues. I think the prioritization would need to go to climate change, adaptation and resilience, and it's not just Arup saying that. I think the World Bank are devoting 50% of their finance to work related to climate change, adaptation and resilience. And when an organization like the World Bank are focusing on one area so strongly, it gives you a good indication of where they see the value in terms of impact that they can have. So I think that's very important. And then in all the disaster risk reduction contributions that we can make, didn't see as much as I would like about utilizing nature-based solutions. And to me, nature-based solutions to these issues, where we can, ecosystems, biodiversity, all that should be prioritized, and that all requires research. I know that particularly relates to the climate-related hazards and risks, not so much to the seismic and volcanic. Just to respond to the sort of the third area that you asked us to comment on, with regard to other comments that we'd like to make. Some of the speakers alluded to the difficulty of dealing with the uncertainty, and I think the probabilistic methods that Carmine is describing help with the dealing with uncertainty, because it's the same calculation methods that you use whether things are certain or uncertain. So using probabilistic approaches are a good way forward, and hence the falling back on that risk equation, hazard times exposure times vulnerability, works equally well. Generally, in my other comments, and I think a number of speakers have alluded to it, is the focus on the poor. And the poor are the most vulnerable. They are in the most exposed areas, and they are the most impacted. And when we talk about the poor, we have to be careful about that definition. But depending on your definition, at least 40% of the world's population are defined as poor. And it's hard to get your head around that number, but that's 3.5 billion people. So if we're able to help 3.5 billion people and improve their situation, we're doing a huge contribution. And I took those numbers from the World Bank. So, and I know that's the aim of the World Bank, is to improve the lives and livelihoods of poor as a focus. My second point is related to cultural heritage, and I've taken a quote from the recent IPCC 6th assessment report, and they say African cultural heritage is already at risk from climate hazards. Most African heritage sites are neither prepared for nor adapted to future climate change. So I think that's another area for focus. Now, I know lives and livelihoods are most important, but cultural heritage is being overlooked, and I think that's an area for focus. And then my final point, although I could make many, and it was such an interesting workshop session that I could talk for a long time, but a point was made about open sharing of information. And I think it was from the University of Huddersfield, and I really strongly support this, that I think we're still missing out on an important opportunity to share better. And I can't see why it is that in this digital age that we can't share better, particularly when I look to the digital tools like the World Bank's Open Knowledge Portal that's already available, that these sort of things are readily available, when we've just got to find ways to be sharing better so that everybody can take advantage of it, but particularly in developing world context, and particularly for the urban poor. Thank you.
Many thanks, Matthew. Some very good points there. Terence, can I just check, are you online? Hello, Terence. I understand he had problems with a battery, so I think he's unfortunately dropped off the call. Okay, we are a little over time, but I think Atale wanted to go back to show some things on his slide. So let's just go back to that for a minute or two. I can share my screen for you.
Thank you, John.
Here you go. Hopefully you can see that now. Can you see my screen?
No, I don't.
Ah. Try again, sorry. Sorry, this was supposed to be a better way of doing it, but not so far. Let's try again.
Yeah, let's try again.
Okay, is that working now?
Yeah, that's it.
On you go.
Okay, thank you, John, for giving me the chance to repeat what I said earlier. And again, thank you everyone for inviting me to reflect my opinion as an African. So what I would like to emphasize here is there must be capacity to monitor natural events or natural hazards from the African perspective, and governments also has to be aware of that. So what I would like to say here is that the African governments or East African governments in particular, their attention is episodic and dangerous for developing mitigation capacity in the region, because their response is very episodic. If an earthquake happens in Ethiopia, for instance, in that week of occurrence, there will be a lot of attention from the government and from the media, and then a week after or two, then it will be back to square one, and you know, people simply will forget what happened. So there is not much attention. And episodic international collaborations for natural episodic activities also. That means that from my experience, we have very excellent collaborations with a lot of British and American scientists, French scientists in earthquake and dike intrusions. So their appearance or interaction with us is also episodic. They come only when the event happens, and in between we miss a lot of excellent data and natural events. So that's a problem. We are missing signs and fail to reduce risk because of lack of funding for rapid response. That means when an event happens, we have no chance to go immediately on the scene, record data, and you know, so that's because of the bureaucracy in Ethiopia, for instance, or maybe in other African countries as well, and because of lack of immediate availability of the finance and the field logistics. So that's one thing. And brain drain and staff retention is also another challenge in general. So experts are not well paid to sustain their professional service here in many observatories. So even some of them can be taxi drivers while they are seismologists in some observatories. So these are really key challenges for addressing disaster risk reduction in my perspective in Africa or in Ethiopia in particular. So next slide, please. In this, yeah, thank you. So in the emerging research priorities, I think what should be done is that mapping the geography or localities of natural hazards, for instance, which areas are flood susceptible, or which areas are volcano and earthquake susceptible, hazard assessment especially, which is in its entirety. You know, when we talk about hazard assessment, it's a lot about catalogs and site response and many other things. So there must be emphasis in high priority or high quality research in these areas. Plus also in many African countries, they don't have a building code, national building code for earthquakes, for instance. So no attention is really given to that. So this is research priority areas, I would say. Building human and equipment capacity for rapid response. For instance, this one, many countries susceptible to earthquake disaster do not have their own monitoring facilities. So we should work towards that end. Financing and supporting monitoring facilities in East Africa. This is also another problem. So a lot of countries in our region, they don't have their own monitoring facilities, and they don't know even what's going on, maybe from USGS or from the news. So as an expert, they're left alone, and there should be capacity in that regard. The last slide, please, John. Yeah, what I would like to add in here is that expanding and strengthening real-time data flow facilities and expertise. For instance, there must be real data flow for MET offices or seismic networks, for instance. Some of us do, but really not the state of the art. Even some countries with no seismic station being hosted in that country, they can pull data from international data centers like IRIS-USGS or GEOPHON in France or Germany, also GFZ and many others, without even hosting a station. They can have real-time data flow, which they can monitor their environment. But there must be funding and expert support for that purpose. And support also local experts if there is a genuine concern from the international donor community. I said this because I tried to mention earlier in my previous attempt that you know, there are some freelance consultants during the Mozambique earthquake of 2006 and from the Karonga event. I think funding was given to some international consultants from World Bank. So I think it is good to put the local experts on board, the governments and local experts in the East Africa region to be part of that initiative. Otherwise, there will be no capacity to build in the region. So it, in a way, in one way or another, it affects the disaster reduction initiative. And my last remark is build civil protection framework for risk reduction to be possible in each countries of concern. This is actually the main issue, because in every country, almost in the East African region, I'm not sure if there is any country which has a civil protection framework for disaster management in its entirety. I mean, it can be flood, drought, earthquake, or volcano, any natural hazard. There should be some knowledge-based institutes in the country, and those knowledge-based institutes which can monitor the natural event should report the severity of the event to some government organ somewhere, and then rapid response or some engagement will be mobilized from the government or from the defense ministry or whatever. So there is no such a coordinated network of disaster management network in each country. That's what I would like to say. Thank you, John and Joe, for giving me second chance to reflect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aslan. Yeah, sorry about before, but thanks for making those points. So unfortunately, we're somewhat over time. I'll just check. Is Terence there? Just last chance. Are you there, Terence? Okay, unfortunately, it seems that he has lost his connection. So unfortunately, we can't hear from him, but we'll try to get his thoughts to put them on the website later. Just to conclude, just a few points of practicalities. Please remember this was recorded. We will post the PDFs and recordings of the presentations online within about the next 2 weeks. If anybody doesn't wish anything they've said to be posted online, then please email Joe and you can arrange for that to be redacted. I'd again encourage all participants to post points on the Padlet. If you can put the link back in the chat, please, Joe. We will leave that open for the rest of the day. So if anybody has any further thoughts on reflection on the day, then please post those on the Padlet and we'll take those into consideration as we move forwards. Please remember the webinars next Friday and then 2 weeks after that on the 25th of March. It's a series. Next week we're hearing from our colleagues in Malawi from various academic institutions and government departments and ministries. So I'm sure that'll be very worthwhile and we'll learn a lot from that. And then the final one, we will look at pathways forwards for future research, taking into consideration things raised today and next week. So the links for the registration for the other webinars, if you haven't done, we'll put in the chat in a moment. If you haven't already got it. And please do advertise these webinars to other colleagues who may want to join us in future weeks or catch up on what's been said today online. Finally, it just remains to say thank you very much to all our speakers and the panelists and all the participants for contributing, giving your very useful thoughts and insights. And we hope to see you in the next couple of webinars. Okay, thank you.